Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hillary. This is a special bonus episode of the podcast. Last week, the South African Trade Association, BPESA, hosted their Global Business Services Investor Conference and Awards in Durban, South Africa. I didn't go to the event, but Peter Ryan of Ryan Strategic Advisory asked me if he could effectively take over the podcast to talk to some of the analysts and investors who did visit. You're about to hear a conversation between Peter with Felix Serrano, the co-founder and CEO of Activus Connect, and Adrian Smith, the CEO of ATAC. Felix is based in the US and Adrian is based in Canada. And listeners to this podcast will know that Peter is also based in Canada. Both Felix and Adrian run companies that are hiring in the CX environment. So it's interesting to hear what they made of their visit to South Africa and just to hear in general what's developing there in the CX environment. Okay, let's go to this special bonus conversation on South Africa now.
Okay, well, thanks very much to our friends Felix Serrano from Activus Connect and Adrian Smith from ATAC in Toronto for joining us today. Now, we're coming on the heels of the BPESA GBS Global Summit, which took place in Durban, South Africa last week. And truly, I think in many, many ways, it can be considered a very successful event. It encapsulated a lot of what South Africa is looking to do to try and position itself as a logical offshore destination of choice for not just the outsourcing community, but truly outsourcers which have focused around value as part of their broader proposition. And we're very fortunate today to have two very strong individuals from the outsourcing community, people with a great track record when it comes to looking at what needs to be done to augment customer experience to the nth degree, and also looking at the different value that can be derived from various offshore locations and nearshore locations for that matter. So Adrian Smith from ATAC and Felix Serrano from Activus Connect, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
Delighted, absolutely delighted. And thanks very much to Mark Hillary for engaging with us to find out a little bit more about what went down in Durban, and more importantly, the impressions that both of you had with regards to the activities. You know, Felix, I'm going to kick off with yourself. You have been a professional in the outsourcing space for as long as I can remember, and I go back well over a decade now. I'm curious to find out, as somebody who had previously visited South Africa and somebody who had seen a little bit of what South Africa could do from the perspective of customer experience delivery, and not just customer experience delivery, but customer experience delivery for consumers in a different demand market. I'm curious, what were your impressions about South Africa, your previous trip, and what you saw in Durban last week?
Sure. Great question. I think first and foremost, I saw a country that was taking more deliberate steps to support growth in a very specific vertical. And so the red carpet was rolled out. But beyond that, I think when you look at the deliberate steps that have been taken to support the growth of the BPO sector, it was tangible. You could see how much infrastructure development there's been, how much collaboration with private business there's been between government and private business. And so my first trip was about 12 years ago, and it was a very different picture then. It was aspirational at that point. I think it was more tangible, and you can see a clear roadmap to continued investment and growth in that sector. In terms of the raw material that we experienced when we were there, that being sort of the talent on the ground, I mean, it was breathtaking, and not dissimilar to many countries that are emerging and that have high unemployment and looking to create employment opportunities. You see the youth that are going to form part of the sector as being very motivated. I saw that a few levels above here. The unemployment rate was so high that the eagerness for agents, as we refer to them, ambassadors, to be employed and to be willing to learn new skills was of the best that I've seen really in the industry. That's not to discredit any other country that's continued to emerge in this sector, but what we saw here, I think, was pretty special.
And Felix, I believe you're probably referring to the impact sourcing initiatives that we are so familiar with in South Africa, specifically related to the Harambee program, right?
Correct.
Yeah, very unique program and very inspiring too. Adrian, if I can flip over to yourself, I know that over the course of the past 6 to 12 months, you personally have had the opportunity to explore a number of different offshore and nearshore locations. In fact, I was on one of those visits with you most recently to the Grand Bahama, which I think we can all agree was a tremendous success.
Yes.
You've also had a chance to explore Central America to some degree. Given the different visits you've done from the standpoint of the past several months, could you give us maybe an idea about where South Africa fits into some of the various offshore delivery points that you've had a chance to witness on the ground?
Yeah, definitely, Peter. Well, first I want to say that the trip to South Africa was my first trip, and I went there with zero expectations as to what could be offered. And it was very eye-opening to hear the numbers of the unemployment rates that were there, and it was very positive to see the steps that are being taken to address that issue. Another thing that stood out to me while we were in South Africa was how the BPO community was working together across all platforms to address the issue. But to more directly answer your question in regards to traveling and looking at different nearshore options, South Africa fits in very well in regards to what I would consider positive growth and scaling aspects for the BPO sector, with the initiative that you mentioned with Harambee and how they upskill the youth in that area for a specific BPO sector. For the BPO sector, sorry.
Great stuff. Great stuff. Thanks, Adrian. Curious from the standpoint of how South Africa was positioning itself over the course of the past few days that we spent there. You know, traditionally, and Felix, you'll remember this from your trip down. Mark, I know that you'll probably recall this from the various analyst visits that we've had the chance to go on. It's always tried to position itself as the logical destination for servicing the UK consumer or the consumer that you might find in Australia and New Zealand. Although this time around, I saw a strong shift in mindset, and the focus was very much on North America. How best South Africa can align itself with the Canadian consumer or the American consumer. Felix, I'll throw it back to you. What do you think that South Africa brings to the table from the perspective of being able to servicing American and Canadian consumers, or being able to work with North American enterprises? Is South Africa going to find the same sweet spot on this side of the pond that it has been able to find with the UK and Australia over the course of the past decade?
You know, I think that remains to be seen. Their value proposition is strong. The availability of talent is undeniable. The accent neutralization we found to be sort of quite great as we were reviewing the various facilities. I see clear correlation between back office work and collections work and sort of very specific work in the BPO sector. I think there's a question mark with regards to the extent to which they'll be able to penetrate the voice side of the market. And so I know that they have very deliberate initiatives there. I see clear lines, though, in the non-voice sectors and in some of the capability sets that don't require that voice isn't as important or accent isn't an important. So credit and collections, as an example, travel to some extent equally applies. So I think we need to see what the next 5 or 10 years look like. That said, the number of U.S.-based campaigns that were presently supported was surprising, and it was great to see. By the way, we saw a lot of travel and leisure. We saw a lot of credit and collections, which was great to see as well. So I think there were a lot of positives. I think it will be interesting to see the extent to which they'll be able to compete with areas like the Philippines and India, who equally have large labor pools and have established presence in the North American marketplace.
And that's a very good point, because obviously it's a very scalable location in terms of the population. One of the things that I think really strikes to a lot of people is the fact that it's not centered in one particular community or one particular city. There's multiple cities that can be drawn from in terms of talent. That's very important, as we know, when North American enterprises are considering an offshore location which they can perhaps move some or all of their various contact center or back office services. Adrian, I'd be curious from you, could you give us a sense, were there any things in South Africa that raised any red flags for you in particular, or any concerns that were brought up with regards to what you saw, or any points of discussion, or anything you observed just in your moving around Durban or any of the other spots that you might have visited while you were down there?
Not necessarily red flags or a red flag, so to speak, but when we were down there, my business partner and I, we took the time to speak with some of the youth that were going through the upskilling systems through Harambee and other sites. And the passion that these individuals had towards growth and setting goals and the hunger that they had to achieve these was very impressive. The only thing, like I said, for me that was surprising was the unemployment rate of approximately 40%, and of that 40%, 65% are women or single mothers, and it's just for the single mothers that were there. The main, I guess, issue or topic that was brought up was the fact of getting them access to these locations or centers so that they can take advantage of the opportunities.
Okay, very interesting. So I'll throw a question to both of you, gentlemen. I'd be very interested to find out your views going forward, going into 2020 and beyond, from the perspective of being North American outsourcing operators, running very successful North American outsourcing firms. What does South Africa need to do to potentially win your investment or the investment from outsourcers that are based in the US and Canada? What are the outsourcing executives, what's the outsourcing community going to be looking for from South Africa to go from being perhaps a mild interest after a visit to being an actual value proposition that they're willing to set up bricks and mortar space in or to partner with?
I'll let Felix lead that response.
I think Felix is on mute.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think when you look at many of the countries that have continued to grow in the BPO space, the organizations that are behind that growth have been really clear and articulate about what the value proposition is. And value proposition not now referring to simply the availability of talent, but more so what the tax advantages are and what the support mechanisms are going to be within the country. I think that as South Africa continues to emerge, it will be very important for them to make it very clear to the world what the value beyond having a lot of talent is to any prospective investor looking to set up shop, whether that's an actual BPO looking to set up shop or as they're courting or attracting brands that may be considering bringing business. I'll tell you that I didn't find when I went, I sort of had a bit of a question mark on what security would look like. And I didn't find in my time there any moments in which I felt not secure. I think very similar to anywhere you would go around the world, you apply common sense, the hours you're around and the locations that you're in. And so for me, it was refreshing to see how safe it did feel, at least in the areas that we were in. But beyond that, I think the country has to do sort of a very deliberate job at making sure that they roll out all of the information that's relevant regarding infrastructure and scalability around infrastructure and how they'll support the expansion and how it will continue to grow and foster, and then what the economic advantages are for anyone choosing to make an investment in the country. Great.
Adrian, I'll throw it over to you.
I'm correct. Thank you. I think that in overall, as Felix mentioned, I mean, just covering the basic economic structures, the infrastructure that's there, and how scalable the talent pool is. I think once that's presented and it becomes relevant or it becomes visual to the potential investors, the platforms that are available to investors is very appealing.
Yeah, no question. Do either of you think that the issue of multilingualism could impede the growth in South Africa? Obviously, English is abundant and very readily found in all major centers, but we all know that English is just one part of the equation in North America. I didn't see a lot of French or Spanish that was on offer in South Africa. Do you think that this is something that could be a stumbling block, or is it something that can be overcome?
I don't think so. I don't think that a location needs to be all things to everyone. I think the availability of good English makes them a viable growth engine. If you look at where BPO has continued to expand, you can see very easily where those markets will be tapped out at some point. I mean, we go through this cycle, and so South Africa is one of the parts in the world with availability of good English in a world in which sort of English is the primary language spoken. Not in all markets, but certainly one of the largest. So I would say no. I don't think it holds it back. You still have Latin America and other places throughout the world that very well serve the other languages. So I wouldn't view that as an impediment at all.
Cool. Okay, excellent. So, Mark, I'm going to bring you into the conversation, and I'm going to turn the tables a little bit. You're not asking the question this time. I'll throw one or two at you. Obviously, you have been somebody who's traveled to South Africa on multiple occasions to find out what's going on, to observe the expansion and the evolution of the value proposition. I know that you weren't able to make this particular visit in Durban, but I'd be very curious to get your sense in terms of what you observed, what you were following on social media, and the various news elements that you were getting during the course of the visit. How does what you're seeing in South Africa now contrast with perhaps what you've seen in trips in 2016 or in 2012 or in 2011? Where do you see the country, where do you see it having come from? But more importantly, where do you see it going? And what does South Africa need to do? What does the industry association need to do in order to make sure that it stays relevant and really front of center for investors from around the world?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I'm sorry that I missed out on this trip, but happy to sort of throw in a few thoughts at the end. I think that I've been there several times over the last few years, and I think that what we've seen is this evolution from focusing on the contact center agents and essentially a sort of job creation strategy, maturing into a genuine sort of knowledge industry. And so I think that one of the areas where South Africa is becoming particularly important is the fact that the agents inside the contact center are now much more highly skilled than the requirement was in the past. And I think that plays to their strength. Something that they can offer is this kind of omni-channel supporting, multi-skilled agents. So I think that's definitely one area where they need to approach things a little differently, because you're talking about different skills, not just very basic agents able to take voice calls, and they should use this as a differentiator. I think that one of the problems is that you still have very good companies there. So the companies on the service side that are offering these type of services, all the big names are there, and you have some local players as well. But there's a sort of an interesting dynamic. The trade association is working to promote the whole region, and they organised the event that you were at. The government definitely seems to be focused on job creation. So I think that's going to get interesting over the next couple of years, because I think as we move away from warehouses full of hundreds or even thousands of agents and start talking more about how do we manage, a 50-50 split between an automated contact center using RPA or other kind of chatbots. We need skills to actually program those chatbots, but that's not necessarily filling 100 agent seats. So I think that we're going to see an interesting dynamic there as the industry changes.
Very true, and some very sage thoughts, I think, from somebody who has had the opportunity to see South Africa up close over an extended period of time. Well, gentlemen, thank you to each and every one for having joined us today for this podcast recording. I think that I will look forward very much to not only hearing you on the podcast, but also to hear some of the reactions of stakeholders in South Africa, as well as potentially interested investors that might very well be giving South Africa a look right now. There's a lot happening in the country. There's a lot of different moving parts, but from my own perspective, I was delighted to see the event come off when we were on the ground so well. It was truly inspiring to see the great work that continues to go on, both commercially and from an impact sourcing perspective. And that was certainly on show. I think Felix and Adrian, you can agree, on the final night of the gala when there was multiple examples about how this is actually being put to work, how melding the social and the commercial together is truly taking form in South Africa and really changing lives as well.
Agreed.
Definitely.
Great. Well, thanks very much to all of you, and we'll look forward to hearing you on the podcast when it goes live, and to hopefully seeing you both on the next trip to South Africa.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. Please take a moment to review the podcast because this helps other listeners to find it. And if you have any suggestions, then get in touch with me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm @Mark Hillary with 2 L's, or just search Google for Mark Hillary.